August 29th, 2021. What I'd like to talk to you this morning about is Ta'ameh HaMisvot, the reason for the Misvot. Now, the name of the class, The Truths of Halacha, Part 5, as I say in all these sorts of circumstances, even if you miss the first 4 parts, that won't in any way harm your understanding of this class. It will aid, it'll supplement the general understanding and direction that we'll go in, but it's unnecessary to have been at or listened to any of those classes to understand this one. Now, what I'd like to specifically address is the following type of issue. Some people have delved into why is it that we perform specific mitzvot, or any mitzvot. Harambam being one of the primary traditional sources that really delves into that. In his Moreh Nevuchim and Helek Gimal, if you have opened it, and you may have enveloped yourself in his world of philosophy, you'll notice, if you're honest with yourself, there are several statements, many, which won't sit easily with you. I guess it already threw Isaac off. But in other words, you'll notice that many of the mitzvot, not just 1 or 2 or 5, many of the mitzvot, Harambam in his Helek Gimal of Moreh Nevuchim says the reason we don't do this, or the reason we do this, is to counter the ways of Avodah Zarah. Now, that's a startling statement for a person living in 21st century America, but really worldwide. Are we really performing mitzvot of the Torah because of an ancient fear of Avodah Zarah? Does that sit well with you? So you'll say, no, it's tradition. I'll accept. But Harambam, who's living during a time during which, not so different from ours, there's not much Avodah Zarah prevalent in his world. Is he comfortable with that interpretation? Is he writing it because that is the understanding of truth?
Considered Christianity Avodah Zarah.
Well, he might have, but not the type of Avodah Zarah that he's referring to, for example, when he says that sacrifices, which we'll address, are to counter or to contend with it. When he talks about basar behalav being in some way or fashion to counter Avodah Zarah. So it's true, even if Christianity was for Harambam or for other poskim a segment, a way of Avodah Zarah, these ways are not the ones of danger of the Christians, generally speaking.
Buddhism, Avodah Zarah?
That's a wonderful question. We generally assume no, but I know very little about it, so I can't really give you a halachic decision on that matter.
With the wigs.
There's no deity.
Yeah, that's what they say. Anyway, so here's the direction that I want to go in arriving at an approach to dealing with a proper, in my mind, understanding of Ta'ameh HaMisvot, what they mean to us, what they don't mean to us, and so on. I'll take you to a broader spectrum for just a moment, and I'll talk about Misvot in general, or Halacha in general. The first 2 sources are very, in my mind, traditional sources in the context of Misvot and Halacha as we know it. The first one, the Gemara in Masechet Eruvin and Daf Yod Gimel Amud Bet, one which in these classes, in the Truths of Halacha classes, we've returned to time and again and again and again. It's the Gemara which has the following statement: Amar bi Abba Amar Shemuel Shalosh Shanim Nehleku Bet Shammai uBet Hillel. It was for 3 years that the Midrashim or the Bet Midrashim of Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel disputed one another. I mean, of course, we know it as a whole lot more than 3 years. In the scheme of things, we're dealing with thousands of years in the legacy of their words. Halalu omrim halacha kamotenu. Halalu omrim halacha kamotenu. Both Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai claimed their stake in truth or in halacha. Yase'a bat kol ve'amra. There was a heavenly voice, says the Gemara, which emanated. Why is it called a bat kol? Nobody's fully certain. Best interpretation is that which suggests that it's almost a reverberation. It was an echo of sorts. So a bat means the child, means the descendant. It's not something direct. It's something you kind of hear after the fact or on the side in some way. Anyway, elu va'elu divrei Elohim hayim v'halacha kebet Hillel. There's almost a self-contradictory statement. On the one hand, both Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai are right. However, halacha is like Bet Hillel. But if they're both right, and I'm using the word right for divrei Elohim hayim, the words of the living God, how is it? Go ahead. That's a reference to God, of the living God. I'm describing it as truth, rightfulness. In some way or another, they're both representative of truth. They're both standing in for the divine truthfulness of the living God. But the halacha is like Bet Hillel. How do you explain? If they're both right, had we choose Bet Hillel? So that's what the Gemara goes on to deliberate and to explain and it interests it. Why is Bet Hillel the one who were chosen? But fundamentally, how can you claim that when both one who says asur and he who says mutar dispute one another, they're both right? How's it possible that contradictory statements are both right? Ritva, one of the first to address this sort of matter, in his Hidushim to Masechet Eruvin, right there, cites from Chachmei Sorfat. Chachmei Sorfat meaning the French rabbis. He quotes from there, he says, He'ach efshar, how's it possible to say, Sheyehu elu va'elu divrei Elohim hayim, how's it possible that both of these are the words of the living God? V'zeh oser v'zeh matir. Whereas on the other hand, they have contradictory statements. One says it's prohibited, the other one says it's permitted. V'tirsu, and the response, and this response of Chachmei Sorfat in Ritva is echoed by many others in different ways with nuanced differences. We've read in Dirashot Haran, he says something similar in a different way, and then later in the Hakdamat Ksot HaHoshen, and many other sources have similar statements along the following lines: Ki keshe'ala Moshe lamarom lekabel haTorah, hir'u lo al kol davar v'davar 49 panim le'isur ו49 panim leheter. When Moshe was up in the heavenly abode during those 40 days prior to reception of the Torah, after the reception of the Torah, he's there being shown 49 ways. Now the word number 49 we have to take with a grain of salt. We have to understand that maybe it's infinite ways, maybe it's just many ways. But the point is there were and are so many ways of cogently and not conclusively, persuasively arguing that it's asur on this matter, and just as many ways to argue in the counter direction that it's mutar. V'sha'ala HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and say the rabbis, so to speak, Moshe turned to God and said, I'll say what's going on. Ve'amar sheyeh ze masur lechachmei Yisrael shebechol dor vador. This matter will be handed over to the scholars, to the leaders of Am Yisrael in every generation. V'yihyeh hachra'a kamotan, and the final verdict on how to practice will be handed to them. We've in a different class noticed there are several places in Talmud where the Hachamim use those words. This is a matter which was handed over into our hands in order to determine. For example, the Isur of Melachan Holamoed. The Gemara Masechet Hagigah has it as being a derasha of the rabbis, understanding this as an Isur from the Torah, but the determination of the contours, the structure of it, Masur Lideh Hachamim. Okay, so you have specific one other circumstance where those sorts of words come up that comes to mind is on Kippur. The Torah says Ve'innitem et nafshotechem. It has 5 references of inui on Kippur. What does it mean to have inui, to have affliction of some sort? Can't be fully certain. The general understanding is, well, maybe some of them are from the Torah, maybe the Isur Melacha, maybe the Isur Achilan Shtiyah are from the Torah, maybe the rest are only Midrabbanan, they're only rabbinical in nature. I refer to not wearing leather shoes, not sexual relations, bathing and anointing and so on. But a counter-argument is, no, these are Isurim from the Torah, but the Torah never said those words. Mas'uli de Hachamim. The Hachamim had the ability to interpret it as such. But that's not my issue right now. My issue right now is to notice and to realize that when it comes to determining halacha, to determining the definition of A or B in the Torah, is this mutar or asur, based on a headline which was given to me, a principle which was passed down from the Torah, there are almost infinite ways in which I can argue one way and infinite ways I can argue in the other. How do I ultimately determine that? Okay, so that's determined hachamim b'chol dor vador. But the interesting part is, I'm open to, and the statement of the Gemara, a very traditional statement of Elu va'elu divrei Elohim hayim, not only open to it, it embraces what I'll call a multiplicity of truths. That's the truths of halacha. Very nice, Gabby. Living. So I say it's halacha as milashon halicha. It's hayim. It's alive. It has movement connected to it.
It's funny because I find that a lot of people that I speak to use the halacha not to turn off, but I often hear, I follow halakha, as if it's this black and white prescription that has no nuance.
And become stagnant.
But it's exactly, it should be exactly
The opposite, indeed. I mean, the difficulty with this approach as opposed to that approach is you're assuming and accepting the competency of people to be sensitive to nuance, to be able to appreciate the system, to understand the development of it.
Who's nuance? My nuance?
Okay, but that's Masubi. Yeah.
Some would say that it doesn't matter if it's asur as long as you follow the rules that the rabbi set down.
Well, ultimately, it's a nice suggestion. Ultimately speaking, the Gemara does say halakha bet Hillel. So, in other words, for that time, certainly. For example, although this is hotly debated, but there is some sort of tradition, Kabbalistic tradition or otherwise, that in Yemot HaMashiach, halakha will no longer be like Bet Hillel, but rather like Bet Shammai. Now, this is hotly contested because we don't have good sourcing for this. If anything, we have better sourcing that halakha will always be like Bet Hillel. But that sort of argument, that sort of statement, and it's thrown around easily, that in the future, halakha is going to be like Bet Shammai, and I'll explain to you why, X, Y, and Z. Oh, that's a crazy statement. You're telling me everything we're practicing today will be negated in the future during a time of knowledge? So perhaps I should be going like Bet Shammai right now. So yes, Jaime, underlying this is a general principle of tapping into the truth of Torah and finding it inherent in the words. But in terms of practice, they are not stagnating, but they are giving a certain structure to it. Now, I mentioned this as a way of introduction to talking about Ta'ameh HaMisvot as well, because this is a whole lot more radical than what I'm about to suggest. And this is what's already black on white. This is what's already, generally speaking, accepted as an interpretation to the Gemara. I can argue both Asur and Mutar, and they can both be right, but I'm going to practice one over the other based on the determination of generation or of development of some sort or another. Now I bring you to top.
Based on it could be based on the community that you live in.
Indeed,
And the world
indeed,
that you live in.
indeed. As way of example to what Joey Shami's mentioning is it might be dependent on community. It's rare today, and it's rare today that a community will practice an altogether different, not humrah, different approach to halakha. But my favorite example for that is the following. I mentioned in the Gemara class just a few weeks ago. The Gemara is uncertain what shivarim, what teruah is. The Torah says Yom Teruah on Rosh Hashanah. What is a teruah? So the Gemara is uncertain. The Gemara says it's either what we call today a teruah, or it's what we call today a shivarim. Of course, the Gemara ultimately says Rabbi Avahu was midaken, that we do both. But what was happening? Ask the Rishonim, what was happening until the day of Rabbi Avahu? What happened last year? Uncertain whether it's a shivarim or a teruah. It's one thing, as I was going to say, what about tefillin of Rabbeinu Tam? Okay, but that's inside the box. But I heard the teruah last year. At what point was there a breakdown in this that I forgot? So Ezra's now going to quote to me Harambam that the ways of galut and exile caused this to us. It's a stretch to argue. I mean, he writes that. Harambam does write that, but it's the ways of exile that brought us to forget. I mean, it's not. Even if you heard the shofar as a child, you were 5 years old, and you heard the middle sound, and you were exiled, and you didn't go to a synagogue, you didn't hear for 60 years, you still remember something about those sounds. Someone remembers something about those sounds. It was that much lost. But that's Harambam's approach. Ran Rabbeinu Nisim and Masechet Rosh Hashanah.
Shema Yisrael, that's how they found Holocaust.
Indeed.
We still hear 10 different versions the way it was
So-
in Helen.
So,
Everyone says a different version the way it was.
right.
the way it was.
But you want to know why? Because in Halab, every synagogue did something different.
Exactly.
Even though we pretend everyone did the same thing, right? But so Ran quotes from the Geonim, from I think Rav Amram Gaon, the following approach. That's a very important approach. He says the way this was until the days of Rabbi Avahu, very comfortably was that community did shivarim. Their understanding of teruah was shivarim, and that community, what we call shivarim, that community's interpretation of teruah was what we call teruah, and nobody had a problem with that. And if you were spending Rosh Hashanah at the in-laws that year in the other community, so you heard the other type, everybody accepted it as, and Jaime, this comes back to your point, as a viable approach to the matter. Says. So then what happened? Then people started to get circumspective. People started to get a little bit suspicious. How could it be that the Torah says Yom Teruah and they're doing X and the others are doing Y? doesn't sit well with us. As a result, they came about and formalized it. They brought a certain structure that would go across the board to all communities. But in its most, quote, ideal sense, that was unnecessary. That formalization, I mean, I say it all the time in the context of prayer as well. The formalization of prayer is, to a certain extent, a tragedy. It's got its positives, but it took away the vibrancy of prayer. It's true, you can't trust me that every day I'm going to have a heartfelt prayer. I need some sort of structure. But in an ideal world, wouldn't I be able to? Wouldn't it be a lot more beautiful? Okay, but that all being the case, what I want to specifically address is the reasons for mitzvot and how they in turn, in our mind, should affect the practice, but why they don't more often than not. And the way I'll bring you to that is initially from these these two sources, source number 3 and source number 4. Source number 3 is a very well-known source. It's Harambam's words in Perek Gimel of Hilchot Teshuvah, Halacha Dalid, very appropriate for this time of the year. It says Harambam, Afal pi shetekiat shofar berosh Hashanah gezerat hakatub remez yeshbo. Now those are very interesting words. Although the shofar is gezerat hakatub, ligzor means to cut. It was cut out by the text, and you're told, sound the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. By the way, the text never tells us explicitly to sound shofar on Rosh Hashanah. The text tells us Yom Teruah. Maybe that could be with a trumpet of some sort or another. The Gemara has derashot for how we know it's shofar, but regardless, the statement is, although it's just because we're told, based on tradition, Torah, to sound the shofar, nonetheless, says Harambam, remez yeshbo. What is remez yeshbo? There's some sort of underlying reason or hint that's supposed to come across. Kilomar, for example, or what I mean to say, says Harambam, uru yeshenim mishenatchem v'akitzu nirdamim mitardematchem hippesu b'maasechem v'hisru b'tshuva v'zichru borachem elu hashochichim et haemet behavle hazeman v'shogim kol shnatam behevel varik asher lo yo'il v'lo yasil. In short, awaken yourself from your spiritual slumber. That's the purpose of shofar, says Harambam. Wait a second. What was the introductory words? Afal pishe shofar on Rosh Hashanah, shofar berosh Hashanah gezerat hakatub. What do those words mean? Although it's just written in the Torah, but it's a remez yeshbo. What Harambam seems to be leading us into is, the Torah tells me sound the shofar. The Torah doesn't append the reason to it. Says Harambam, perhaps what we can then glean from the performance of this mitzvah is this emotional experience.
So what you're saying is that the ta'ameh is the most important part of it, or the.
I'm not going that far.
I'm saying that the spirit.
I'm saying it's a very vital part.
Then how you
but
get there is languages
I mean, I like what you're saying. I'm going to take it almost in the opposite direction, but not really. I'm going to go like this already. If we already have accepted that halakha, an objective asur or mutar, is elu va'elu divrei Elohim hayim, I could make the argument that it's X, but I could just as well make the argument that it's Y, and they might both be true, and we're just going to practice one over the other. Same thing when it comes to Tamei mitzvot. In other words, there's an objective activity prescribed by the Torah in terms of performance. Now, what are you going to find in it? You might find in it something altogether different than I'm going to find in it. And you know something? My grandfather, because he didn't live in our generation where we were exposed to some sort of other culture, would have found something altogether different, and so on and so forth into the future. It keeps halakha, it keeps ta'amei mitzvot vibrant, it keeps it very much alive.
But it sounds like the halakha is like the road to get somewhere. But if you don't know where you're going, then what good is the?
That's correct.
I mean,
unless
you need to know the ta'ameh first.
Unless, and here's, by the way, Gabby, you might remember this conversation. It was in Mamie's car. We began this conversation. I'm only fleshing it out now for you. It's this class was very much crafted for that. I promised you I would put it together in a class format. But I'm going in the opposite direction. I'm accepting the structure as described by the Torah, and I'm then living that and finding the meaning for myself. Lemashal, I have a close friend who said to me he was struggling with performance of specific mitzvot. It just wasn't touching him in terms of the ways that he was told it was supposed to experientially affect him. He said he was home on Sukkot, whatever the circumstance was. He was standing with lulav and etrog and going back and forth and saying, ah, and his little child came next to him and with her eyes closed started humming the same thing. And he said for him, that experience, lulav and etrog, was transformed to something probably, but I can't tell you certainly, very different than 10 years ago, than 100 years ago it was experienced by any other Jew. It became this mindful experience of elevate. And he asked me, was I injecting my own emotions to an objective mitzvah? Was that avodah zarah? And I said, absolutely not. That is the experience of the mitzvah. I said, but nobody else experienced that way. I said, but that is, in my mind, the underlying direction of Torah. Here are the God-prescribed actions. Now you find within it the experiential dimension, which will be subjective and should be. Absolutely. What? How? If anything, it's the only slippery part is when you get stuck in your emotions and say that I can come to them differently. Right? In other words, if I say, if I'm only supposed to get there, well, I'll do it this way instead. That's the danger. But there's the same danger inherent in just focusing. I understand, but but it's 100%. But I'm starting in a different direction than them. They start in, I'm accepted. I bought into the system. I say it's a God-given system. I accepted the system. I accepted the system as such. Again, I accepted the system as such, and I accept and understand that within that system, this is the way it was supposed to go. It was never purposed to have been just because of X, Y, and Z. That would already confine it. If I said that mitzvot, and we'll have to get to Harambam in just a second, that mitzvot were only because of Avodah Zarah, then I've left mitzvot in archaeology. If I alternatively said, at the initial giving of those mitzvot, here's what was understood by the people, here's how they experienced it, here's how it was useful in their own lives and coming closer to God. However, over the course of time, it would then take on not new forms of practice, but new form of meaning. I've given Torah a full vibrancy, a full life, an opportunity for each of us throughout the generations to happen. Why would Harambam then spend so much time on talking about past appreciation? I think for potentially, either he doesn't agree with me, or alternatively, if he does agree with me, it's because he now told you the game plan of how to do this. He set forth for you the game plan. You see, once upon a time when they experienced this, this is how they appreciated it. So now, don't just perform this. He wants that evolution to be felt by you, but he more than, so when I talk about the past, just tell me, feel it. No, because he wants you to say, in the past, they actually felt this. This affected them. So how's this going to affect me today? Now he does it again in Mishneh Torah and Hilchot Mikvaot and
mitzvot is revisited every couple of generations.
Of course, but people will sometimes bemoan that. If we have to revisit Ta'amei HaMitzvot, maybe we shouldn't have spent any time on Ta'amei HaMitzvot. Alternative.
That ended up getting brushed aside. It was recently late 1800s, right? Hirsch.
I'm with you, but the suggestion for me is there's a beauty in that, and it's a history, but it's a developed history. It's one which brought us to where we are. Harambam writes in Perek Yod Aleph Hilchot Mikvaot Halakha Yod Bet, talking about the reason for mikveh. Davar barur vegalui shatumot v'taharot gezerot hakatub hen. So there's those words again. You should know tuman tahara gezerat hakatub. Now, generally speaking, when a person hears those words, they think like the friends of Joe Kesri. They say to themselves, we just do it. Chalas, I close my ears. I don't want to hear anything more. And they're not matters which your mind, your seichel, could bring you to. I mean, this is very non-Maimonidean, it seems. They're along the lines of those mitzvot and isurim, which you can't or have to do, and you don't really know the reason. שאינה טומאתית או סועה שתעבור במים, and so to immersion in the mikveh. Nobody's going to argue that tum'ah is actual filth. Look at your body, you're not actually filthy. אלא גזירת הכתובי, והדבר תלוי בכוונת הלב. Those last words, and he'll elaborate upon them right now, are very important. גזירת הכתוב doesn't close it. Gezerat HaKatub, those words speak to absolute potential. Those words then say, that's right, the Torah cut this. God cut this and told you to do this. But now, how are you going to find meaning in this? Ulefichach amru chachamim. Taval v'lo huchzak, ki'ilu lo taval, v'af al pi chen, remez yesh badavar. There's those words again. Nonetheless, there's a remez, just like the shofar. What's that? כשם שהמכוון ליבו לטהר, כיוון שטבל טהור, ואף על פי שלא נתחדש בגופו דבר, the same way a person who immerses their body in that body of water, and their body isn't actually physically changed, but they now achieved the status of tahara, so too, ככה מכוון ליבו לטהר נפשו מטומאות הנפשות, שהן מחשבות האוון ודעות הרעות, כיוון שהסכים ליבו לפרוש מאותן היסוד, והביא נפשו במי הדעת, tahor, says Harambam, so too, move away from all physical immersion. If you immerse your heart, your mind in mehadat, in the ways of proper approaches of emet and so forth, of divinity and spirituality, in such a circumstance, says Harambam, you then have changed yourself. What Harambam has done again is he took a matter, he said without any shame, I can't find any reason for this in the objective sense. And then he said, but you should know. Here's what you can think about when you perform this. Here's how this can affect you. I think that's what Harambam is doing.
So he's accepting the mystery.
And then saying to you,
bring your own,
find your own meaning in it. Indeed.
But he's accepting.
That's right.
that-
Now this is all a setup, Gabby. This is all a setup because the more you accept it, the more you're going to be embarrassed as we go along. I'm just warning you. No, but I like it, yeah.
The system of Harambam is there is a rejected reason. It's not in the Hashkafa of the Torah. He said that's the reason, not acceptable. If you give an acceptable reason, it means we don't accept it, we just don't reject it. So it's valid for as long as it's valid, and then you can give another reason when that reason outlives the scope.
Very good. Very good. I'm glad you said it like
But what
that.
if you can't find it?
No, that's your
Right.
Is there a reason that we just, that if
We
we
don't
can,
reject.
is there an objective reason that we're looking for?
We don't accept it.
You're not being
If the Torah did not state it,
Don't say what the Shem
then the answer is no.
That means we can't find it or it doesn't exist.
No. It means you will find it. You must find it. Says Harambam, that's what Talmud Torah is all about.
Objective.
For Harambam, that is the point. To find the reason.
Only when Torah doesn't
For
exist.
him,
I thought what was that saying that if you believe for a reason, then when that reason goes away, does that mean it's over?
find another reason.
You have to accept
Find another way. That's what I'm telling you.
What if you change the word from reason to meaning?
Meaning. That's what the reason is a hard word in this
But if
context.
you-
In fact,
you know, if you're an intellectually honest person and you
Go ahead.
don't find it, then you can't.
so then you're going to struggle.
So that's the
But
ultimate
if you,
acceptance of what you said in the
but
very
if you,
beginning.
that's
So
right.
difficult.
I agree with you. But
Indoctrination.
yes, that's right. It begins with an
Jewish.
acceptance. It begins with that.
Axiom.
Not so different than many other things that we do in life. You know, not so different
So
than.
find the utility, like you said, like if you're just find the reason.
Yeah.
But accept.
I'm getting to Korbanot, Jaime. Korbanot's going to be interesting. But you know where I'm going already on it. Anyway, just to demonstrate this a bit more before I bring two practical examples, in source 9 and 10, unfortunately out of order. I prepared this and changed my order in the middle and didn't fix it. Source 9 is Harambam's words in the Moreh in Hele Gimal in Perek Chavav. Over there, Harambam is in the midst of beginning and deliberating upon the reasons for mitzvot, and then he gets stuck. He finds a midrash. He writes in the first line from Bereshit Rabbah, and the midrash you'll find it in the third and fourth line of source number 9. Midrash has the following words: "V'chi ma ichpat lo lahakadosh baruch hu ben mishu shochet min hasavar v'mishu shochet min ha'oref." Why does God care about whether you slaughter from the front of the neck or from the back of the neck? Why should he care? The halacha is you do it from the front of the neck. But why does God care? Heve omer, perhaps I should therefore say, says the Midrash, lo nitenu ha-mitzvot, the only purpose of the mitzvot is ela lisrof bahen et habiriot, not lisrof with a sin, litzrof, I'll say it like that for a moment, with a sadi. Lisrof, siruf, means to cleanse. You're misaref kesef and zahav. You take out any of the impurities of the gold and silver. That's siruf, refine is the shene'emar imrat Adonai sirufa. So again, reviewing the words of the Midrash. Does God really care whether you slaughter from the front of the neck or the back of the neck? You have to say the only reason for the mitzvot is to purify you. Says Harambam, what's going on? I've been arguing that all the mitzvot have a reason. I've been arguing that's our whole job in studying Torah, to find the reason for the mitzvot. And what's with this midrash? Midrash says, yeah, but God doesn't really care. Says Harambam in an uncharacteristic, surprising fashion, if you don't know him better, he says, I'll tell you what this midrash means. This midrash doesn't mean the general structure and composition of mitzvot. This means the details of mitzvot. Says Harambam, he goes on, he explains, what type of animal you bring to sacrifice? Not necessarily a reason. How many of those animals you brought? Not necessarily a reason. If, as the rabbis understood it, the pain of the animal, let's say, is equivalent both in front and in back, if that's the underlying reason to shechita, but there's no difference between front or back, no reason for it. What he suggests is the details, the pirtei ha-mitzvah, don't necessarily have a reason. The general concept of each one of the mitzvot has a reason. The details don't necessarily. So then why are we performing them? Says Harambam, sivui habore. That's the dimension of mitzvot of just following. Yes, Joe?
Rabbi Shammah was saying yesterday in his class very quickly that...
Rabbi Shammah will disagree with almost everything I'm saying.
Just, global reason,
just to be clear.
I'm just saying that the global reason would be, it's similar to what I think...
Of Torah.
Here. The global reason of Torah is what is tzedek mishpat, and that the particulars are not he said peripheral, but he didn't mean it in like a, in a casual sense. He just meant that they all point towards tzedek
to get there. Okay. Which will be, I think that's what you're suggesting, defining what sivui habore means. Yeah. Sivui habore means to get onto the path of tzedek u'mishpat, because you're marching, as I understand it, in his army. Right. If you're marching in his army, then you stand for justice and righteousness.
Right. Regardless of what the particulars
Great.
Of the actual...
That's Harambam's argument from this. It appears, this is the way he structures it. He doesn't always let on to why he's saying what he's saying. He structures this when he begins with the midrash. He says, I got all nervous about this midrash. That's got to be the interpretation. Ramban Nachmani, in his commentary to the Torah in source number 10, in Devarim Perek Chavbet, one second, why are we getting so nervous about this midrash? He says, this midrash is a beautiful midrash. Even if we accept that there's a reason for all the details. Now, what are you talking about? The midrash says, Lo nitenu mitzvot el lisrof bahen et haberiot. Says Ramban, did you listen to those words? It's to purify humanity. In other words, what the Midrash is arguing more than anything is, the purpose of the mitzvot is not to affect God. The purpose of the mitzvot is to affect you. He says, be sensitive to the words of the Midrash. It's not why do we care about the difference, it's why does God care about the difference. The response is, it's for in some way to affect you and me in the way that we live. Now listen to those words of Ramban and reflect upon what we've been developing henceforth. What Ramban is telling you is that the mitzvot, the tam for the mitzvot is to bring forth for us some sort of change. Now he might tell you, unlike we're suggesting, that the change is a prescriptive change. X is the change. You're going to have to find that, and if you missed it on X, then you missed the whole point of this mitzvah. A little bit more expansively, the purpose for mitzvot in general, in totality, the holistic vision of mitzvot, according to this midrash, as Ramban is interpreting it, is in order to bring about our changed being. But I'm a changed being in a different way than Gabby and Sharon and Jack and Ronnie. That's right. The suggestion that we're setting forth over here is that change that you'll experience will be different than the change I'll experience, but we'll all come about it through the same activity which is prescribed by the Torah. Here's the objective action, says God. I've embedded this action with infinite potential for each of you to find a meaning in this, your meaning being different than mine. Now go and do it. Now, if that's the case, I'll bring you just 2 examples, because if I brought more, it'll just take too long. On another occasion, I have a whole list of these, so if you're not convinced by these 2, well, you might never be convinced, but at the very least, these will be the first 2 examples, and we have plenty more time on different occasions to develop more, because this is, I don't know, this is something that used to keep me up at night until I kind of wrap my head around this type of approach to the matter. So, again, I began the class by mentioning the basar behalav type of examples. Right? I mentioned there's a whole slew, dozens of mitzvot and averot, which Rambam says is basar behalav. The suggestion, if you understand the direction we're going in, yeah, historically, that was a time during which avodah zarah was the threat. God gave this objective activity, accepting the principles of faith, the specific principle of faith of the eternality, the fact that the Torah will be eternal and won't change. Well, that means that God, in His infinite and divine wisdom, embedded these actions with potential to affect people forevermore. There won't be negativity in it. It'll only find for you the opportunity to tap into a change, to a perception change, to a physical change. In some way, you'll become a better person, called tzedek u'mishpat, if you must. Call it the path of derech haemet, of derech Torah. So, okay, whatever it is, that's the suggestion. So here's 1 or 2 examples. The first example, why is it that we count this thing called Sfirat HaOmer? We have from Pesach, the second day of Pesach, all the way through Shavuot, we count days. I know I'm a little bit, at least I started with Rosh Hashanah business. Now I'll bring you back in time. I was thinking about giving an example from Sukkot. It would be a little bit more appropriate. But this one's a favorite. Why do we count Sfirat HaOmer? So if you look in the Torah, in source number 5 and source number 6, it's quite clear why we count Sfirat HaOmer. As we call it, Sfirat HaOmer. You went from one korban in the Mikdash, the Korban HaOmer, to another Korban, Shtei HaLechem, to the extent that it appears, according to several Midrashim, this was once a mitzvah on Beit Din, on Sanhedrin. This wasn't on individuals. The Sanhedrin was to count. The same way they counted the years until Yovel, they had a formality, a ceremony of counting every single one of those days from one sacrifice to the next sacrifice. Pause for a second. When we will count in this upcoming year, the Omer, are we performing that mitzvah from the Torah or a mitzvah from the rabbis? So you'd imagine it's only from the rabbis. If the whole purpose of the mitzvah is to count from one korban to another korban, and the last time I checked, we're not sacrificing any korbanot any longer, then Sfirat HaOmer today is only a mitzvah midrabanan. That seems quite clear, sufficient in terms of having a very clear approach to this matter. In fact, it's the opinion of Tosafot in Masechet Menachot and Daf Samech Vav. Most argue it's the opinion of Shulchan Aruch, but there's this very important figure whom we keep returning to. His name was Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon in Perek Zayin of Ilchot Midim u'Musafin, Halacha Chaf Bet, Halacha Chaf Dalet. Harambam lays out for us this mitzvah of Sfirat HaOmer, and he makes clear in Halacha Chaf Dalet, here in source number 7, mitzvah zo al kol ish mi Yisrael ubechol makom ubechol zeman. This is an eternal mitzvah, irrespective of where you live and when you live. Wait a second. How can you possibly argue that Sfirat HaOmer is a mitzvah ta'aseh today? If we had Korban, if we had Mikdash, okay, I accept it. We don't have it. The whole purpose, the Torah gives you no other reason other than count from this sacrifice to that sacrifice. How could you possibly make the argument it's a mitzvah ta'aseh today? Harambam in Moreh Nevuchim, in my mind, answers that question. Now, he's not fully clear that he's answering this question. He kind of just lays it out there. But he does so, and in my mind, that's what he's doing exactly what we suggested. If you were to ask, I should have forced you all to answer, why do we count Sfirat HaOmer? But you're all very educated. If you ask a child, why do we count Sfirat HaOmer? What are they taught in school? Another day closer to the Torah is given, and another day is closer to the Torah is given, and so forth. Isn't that what everyone says, right? And Shavuot was Hag Matan Toratenu.
But they were doing exactly what you said. The idea of going from, let's say, barley to bread is the same idea of refining yourself and
Great.
Then we're looking for
Great.
the reason.
So Gabby says with the korbanot represented something greater than just a sacrifice. It was my success agriculturally from one to the next, and that could continue onward. Harambam, living outside of an agrarian society, seeks another reason for it. Says Harambam in the More, Shavuot hu yom matan Torah. First statement, which is a little startling. Look in the Torah, never tells us that Shavuot's the day on which the Torah was given. Kedei lechabed u'romem yom zeh. In order to respect and to hold up to make the day transcendent, sofrim et hayamim and hag harishon ad elav. We count the days from Pesach until Shavuot. You follow what he just did? He just gave us a completely new reason for the mitzvah of Sfirat HaOmer. He gave us a completely new reason for the holiday of Shavuot, which we never found in the text of the Torah. Okay, and he furthermore gave us a whole new reason for Sfirat HaOmer, to the extent that he tells us Sfirat HaOmer is still a mitzvah from the Torah. That's a startling statement, yes?
Rambam is usually very careful when he does philosophical, he doesn't run into technical problems. Here he does. Because if he says, Vatim lechem, Shema Shavuot, you count 49 days and you have Shavuot. Now, it does not matter whether it is a leap month, not a leap month, should not make a difference, and I should have one day.
Okay.
But he's not going to go that way. So he ran into a technicality, which
I understand.
it's not him.
But I'm telling you why he's doing it. I'm telling you why he did this. I understand, so you make my argument better. You say there are technical problems with it, but I'm telling you why he's doing it. Because he says this is a mitzvah from the Torah. And then he scratches his head. I don't know if he did, but if they used to scratch their heads, he scratched his head, right? And then he says, but how could there still be a mitzvah from the Torah? Now he has two options. He could say it's a mitzvah midrabanan, and we'd be okay if he did that. That's an opinion. It seems clear in the Gemara, it's an opinion. But he doesn't do that. He writes explicitly, it's a mitzvah from the Torah. And for whatever reason, that was what he maintained. And now he tells you what underlies that opinion. And what he's doing is saying quite clearly that although the Torah, if anything, tells us a different reason for it, and it's hard to argue that because Torah doesn't explicitly say another reason. Torah says count from one korban to the other korban. At the very least, although the Torah seems to make it contingent on korbanot, he says, but maybe that's not the only reason for it. Maybe this can affect me differently today. Maybe the acceptance of the 50th day being Hag Matan Toratenu, as a result, will now give a new meaning to all of those countings. And it's in my mind, it's revolutionary. But that's what he's doing. And that's his statement over here, fortifying, bringing us back to the initial suggestion of this class, the direction of this class. What is ta'ameh ha-mitzvot? How much do ta'ameh ha-mitzvot tether themselves to the mitzvah to the extent that when it seems irrelevant now, I should no longer perform? The answer is, the old reason seemed irrelevant. Find a new reason. Well, I'll bring you a step further. Here's the controversial part for our crowd. Now I bring you to, and Jaime mentioned it earlier, to korbanot. Korbanot, we have, to a large extent, an entire book in the Torah, Sefer Vayikra, which elucidates, elaborates, and deals with every single one of these details and intricacies of sacrifices. What's the purpose of all these sacrifices? I think most of the crowd is already familiar with the words of Harambam in source number 11 and source number 12 in the More. In Halek Gimal, as I mentioned, Halek Gimal of the More is where he talks about Ta'ameh HaMitzvot. In Perek Lamid Bet, he first talks about Korbanot. And it's a famous statement, so he writes about it in one other place. He says the way it once worked was, the way of sacrifice of the nations of the world to their deities was by means of Korbanot. As a result, says Harambam, taking a nascent nation outside of Egypt who are surrounded by the ways of those nations in terms of practice and worship to their deity, how are you now going to feed them the optimal way of practice of worshiping their deity, the true deity? Are you going to tell them, well, everything everyone else is doing is absolute nonsense, it's ludicrous, and as a result, just close your eyes, meditate, think about me, and connect to me in an intellectual, spiritual fashion? Inconceivable, says Harambam. I know the problem, Gabby, but that's what Harambam, you explained to me the problem. That's what Harambam says. That's inconceivable, it's incomprehensible. As a result, he had a concession of sorts to Am Yisrael. So, okay, you could do it by means of korbanot. Now, by the way, he does go on to state as well, less focused on, that tefillah as well as a concession. He says using words, uttering words, is unnecessary, is not optimal in a connectedness to God. It should be absolutely and purely intellectual. So let me ask you a question. Pause for a second. We're holding by Yemot HaMashiach. We have knowledge of God like the water which covers the seas. That's the description of the prophet. It's the way Harambam finishes Mishneh Torah. Are we going to now have a return to Korbanot? If it was a concession at its onset, Harambam, even furthermore, in his Perek Memvav of the Moreh, talks about the ways of Korbanot, specifically negating the ways of the Egyptians. He describes the ways of Egyptians. He reads the Pesukim in the Torah very carefully, and he suggests that many of the processes of the Korbanot, specifics of the animals that are used in the Korbanot, putting salt on the sacrifice, not having leavened bread on the Mizbeach, each and every one of those was to negate the ways of Avodah Zarah and worship of the Egyptians. I ask you again, most of us are long away from Egypt. And those of us who are not so far away from Egypt never saw these practices in their day in Egypt. What relevancy do these mitzvot have to us any longer? We have a third mikdash, and Harambam writes explicitly, we will. Accepting that, are we going to have korbanot in that third mikdash? It sounds ridiculous. Why should I need that? The whole thing at its inception was a concession. In fact, without asking it in that way, Ramban Nachmani in his commentary to the Torah asks different questions on Harambam in source number 13. In Vayikra, Perek Aleph, Pasuk Tet, says Ramban, wait a second, there's this guy, his name was Noah, in the second parasha of the Torah. He brings a sacrifice, and it's Lereach Nihoach, long before Egyptians and the ways, it seems, of classic Avodah Zarah. There was someone prior to him, there were the Cain and Hevel, they too were bringing sacrifices. There's the very mention throughout Sefer Vayikra, Vareach Nihoach LaHashem. It's some sort of sweet smell for God. I don't know exactly what that means, Harari speaking. I know Ramban knew what that means. I don't know what that means, but I can tell you it doesn't sound very much like concession because you would be thinking that you need to do it otherwise. Says Ramban, this can't be the reason for the Korbanot. Rather, says Ramban, two reasons. One, mystical, okay. And his other reason, less mystical, he says that you're supposed to envision yourself as the sacrifice on the altar, and as a result, imagine yourself being slaughtered, your blood coming out, and understand that should be the punishment for your iniquity, for your wrongdoings, and so forth. Oh, it sounds a little bit along those lines, but that's the suggestion of Ramban Nachmani. Okay, we can accept his suggestion for his time, for his understanding, and so forth, but the question I pose to you is, how different is Ramban Nachmani's interpretation than Harambam's interpretation? Ramban Nachmani might not ring true to many people over here, as Harambam's approach might not ring true. And yet they would both, in my opinion, argue for the continuity of sacrifices. And you might tell me he doesn't mean it, but in two places in his Mishneh Torah, and I'm quite convinced he does mean it, Harambam writes explicitly that we'll have a third mikdash, and in that mikdash we will have the return of sacrifices. He writes in Perek Yod Aleph, Hilchot Melachim, most notably, Halacha Aleph, HaMelech HaMashiach, Atid la'amod u'la'chazir malchut Bet David liyoshna, HaMemshala HaRishona, Ubone Mikdash u'mekabetz nitchei Yisrael. Melech HaMashiach, already describing him as Melech, will restore Malchut Bet David. Anyone who knows about kingship as presented in Peshat in the Torah, that seems to be a concession as well. You'll ask for kingship. Fascinatingly, the description of what Melech HaMashiach will do is bring back the concession of kingship. V'chozrin kol hamishpatim beyamav keshehayu mikodem, and all the laws as they were initially will be restored. Like what? Makrivin korbanot. The first of those is we will begin again to bring to sacrifice. How could he write that? Why would he write that? We're during a time of knowledge, of wisdom, of de'ah. We're already in a time of wisdom and knowledge of de'ah where we don't have those ways of avodah zarah. Why would we have a return to korbanot? How and what would it accomplish for us? And my answer to you is, I'm not fully certain. But what I am certain about is that it won't be to counter avodah zarah, nor will it necessarily, for us at least, be to envision ourselves on that altar. It will mean something else. What do you mean something else? Why would you say such a thing? Because in the system of mitzvot and ta'ameh ha-mitzvot, as we've been setting it forth, we're accepting the objective reality of an action, of a prescribed action. Do X. But what does this mean for me? Well, Rambam says maybe this is what it meant. And historically, yes, that's what it meant. What does that mean over the course of time? It means over the course of time, it'll take on new meanings for different people. You want me to take a guess on this one? I could take a guess, but none of you will like it, but I'll take the guess anyway. Animals will, and already do, represent a certain pride of our own possession of wealth. When you have a good steak, some of us have a good steak dinner, it's very different than mac and cheese. It just is. Animals still have that. We refer to our cars as Lamborghinis, much like or Jaguars, much like the animals. Animals are a source of strength that we, until today, in some way, understand as our own self-amassing of wealth and strength and power. Maybe, what's that?
Nice try.
It's as I said, I don't need to convince you on this. And you know something? I don't need to convince you on anything. You and I, in this era, right, we'll then need to figure out what it means to us.
So when you say reason, you don't mean the reason, you mean your reason.
Yes,
Right?
correct. In fact, just one second. Let me just bring support for this notion in this context specifically. There's a very important book, but less known than others, by Ritva. Ritva was an important medieval rabbi who lives in Seville, in Spain. And so in his book, it's called Sefer HaZikaron. Sefer HaZikaron is a response to Ramban Nachmani's attacks on Harambam. Ramban, in his commentary to the Torah, has many attacks on the philosophical approaches of Harambam. Ritva defends many of them. Yeah, I only bought the book a few years ago. It's not easy to find. I found the book and I flipped through it at specific points. And in this context, so he's got a few angles for defending Harambam, some more convincing than others. The most convincing, certainly in our context, is the following: V'da'ati barav hamoreh beta'am zeh u'beta'amim rabim achirim shekatab b'mitzvot. The reason for Harambam with regards to ta'ameh ha-mitzvot, this one, meaning korbanot and others, כי לא מאשר יאמין הוא עיקר טעם המצווה ההיא, אלא שרצה לתת קצת טעם בהם, עד שאפילו ההמון שבו יודע להשיב בהם גם אפיקורס בדברים שכליים כסד. What he effectively says about this is, these are interpretations of mitzvot. Harambam wasn't 100% certain about them. He was giving you one suggestion. וכן שמענו משלמה שהשיב בתשובת שאלה and we heard, that's how he responded to some of his students, that I'm not fully convinced this is the truth, the only truth to the reason for each of these mitzvot. His son, Rabbeinu Avraham, I don't have Sefer Milchamot here, but I do remember reading it. I remember it being quoted by Maharam el-Shakar. I remember looking it up, but in his Sefer Milchamot, Hashem writes this explicitly, if I remember correctly, in this context as well. He says, with regards to korbanot, it's not the only reason my father may have had, or there might be other reasons as well. Rav Kook, in several of his writings, when he talks about Ta'ameh HaMitzvot, has a similar, not identical approach to the general direction of this class, general perspective that we've been setting forth, and that is, again, the objective reality given and accepted by us, by God, with regards to prescribed mitzvot. Let's call them 613 mitzvot. Now, performance of those mitzvot is mandated. The reason, the meaning that underlies those mitzvot was never mandated, was never explicated on purpose, because each of those mitzvot is to be interpreted through our own personal, individual experiences, context, time of life, specific circumstances of my life as opposed to yours, my upbringing as opposed to yours, my upbringing as opposed to my grandfather's, my great-grandfather's, my grandchild's. Each of those are going to be and must be factors in determining why we perform this mitzvah or that mitzvah. But Rambam gives us historical reasons. That's right. And you might be and perhaps should be convinced that historically that was how it could have affected the majority or all of the people of that time period. That doesn't mean that's the way it's going to affect us. The two examples we brought with regards, in addition to, although we didn't prove it, to all those basar behalav mandates, the specific ones we suggested, the first was Allah. The first was this Firat HaOmer, I think was easier for most people to accept. It was the way many people were raised, that we count the Omer counting up to the Torah's giving. Again, the revelation is, it's not what the Torah says. Nonetheless, it's what Harambam says, and he maintains as a result of mitzvah min HaTorah. The more controversial one is the suggestion that the words of Harambam, when he says we're going to restore sacrificial rights, is to be taken literally, seriously, and therefore to move backward and say, but then why were we doing this? Why are we doing this? And the answer being, we were doing it for some reason back then, which won't match necessarily the reason we'll be doing it today or tomorrow or wherever we do restore these. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen v'amen.